And we're live with the one and only Nicholas Griffin. How you doing, Nick?
I'm good.
It's great to meet you.
You too, guys.
So, the reason why you're here, just released your new book, The Year of Dangerous Days, Riots, Refugees, and Cocaine in Miami in the 1980s. Pretty interesting read, man. I've been diving pretty deep into it as of late, and it's pretty crazy to hear all of the things that are really going on in today's world were happening back, 30 years ago, right in our the city that we all live in. So it's pretty crazy to kind of see the correlation between what happened in 1980, with the death of your main character, and all the stories that followed suit, and really. It's really interesting, man. One of the first things I wanted to ask you was, like, did you see this all coming? Because you started researching for this book. I know I trained your wife, and I was talking to her, and she told me that you started this research 4 years ago. So
Yeah, no, I think it was actually more like 6. So I'd love to say that I'm some sort of I have a looking glass where I can see what happens 6 years down the road, but unfortunately, the sad thing is that these issues that were so prevalent in 1980s, such as race and immigration and drugs, they haven't gone anywhere. They've come back at us in slightly different forms, but they're the same issues. And someone once said that the greatest diplomacy is basically the exportation of issues to the future. Well, that's what we got here. Turns out we haven't moved nearly as far as we thought we'd moved.
Yeah, no, definitely. How did you come about first hearing about the story, as well as going through your research? I'd love to hear about, your process.
Sure. I mean, I moved here down to Miami permanently just over 7 years ago. And, I was always interested in trying to find out why the city was the way it was. And by that, I mean, this is a bizarre city by American standards, right? Every other city in
very
you're right.
Being a Miami native, I can tell you that, born and raised.
Yeah, it's all your fault.
It is my fault.
But every other city in America, immigrants come and they get absorbed by the city and they become part of the city, and the American city wins, and immigration, the immigrants generation to generation change and reflect the city that they've joined. And this is a town that was really taken over by immigrants, and here we are in 2020, and still 63% of us speak Spanish as a first language here, or like me, a second language. So this is something different down here. So I was like, why did that happen? Why is Miami the only city in America which has been like that? And the more research I did, the more all the arrows seemed to point towards this one crazy hinge year, where yes, a lot of the issues were there beforehand, but because of this sort of triple crisis, this 3 storms that converge in early 1980, it sort of accelerates this new Miami into being, which is just such a different place from anywhere else in America.
Still to this day, I think.
Oh yeah.
Still very different than New York and LA.
So I want to ask you, just because I'm curious, I know you mentioned that you started research 6 years ago, but you moved to Miami 7 years ago. Was your reason moving to Miami was because you wanted to write this book and you wanted to do that research, or was it part because you just wanted to move down to South Florida?
No, the real reason I moved down to Miami was because my wife told me we were moving down to Miami. She was the one who came down with
the decisions.
Well, I married a Venezuelan, so I think the answer was that I was destined to live in Miami no matter what I wanted to do.
Now we know the truth.
An absolute wonderful woman. We should probably say that on here. So,
yeah. Hi, honey.
Yeah, I'm gonna see her later today.
Not Josh
so
gets the
beating.
Today.
Yeah, I'm sure I'll hear about it if we don't give her a shout out.
Yeah, so I came. My idea was that I've written. This is the 7th or 8th book that I've written. I was coming down here, and the truth is I tried to pitch a Miami book before I even came down here, thinking I knew what the city was all about. I didn't really have that much of a clue in retrospect, but I tried to pitch this much bigger, more complex book that would follow Miami through the 1980s. and I got shot down by New York publishers on that one.
Wow.
And then I thought, you know what? I know there's some sort of really good idea in here, so I'm just going to start my research anyway and do this on spec for a while and see what happens. And I started digging into the first year, 1980, and I couldn't get out of that first year. So much happens in this city in 1 year that I realized, oh my God, I can tell this whole American story without ever leaving those 12 months. It's just such rich history. And, people don't think of Miami in that terms as because we're such a young city. We're 120 years old here.
Yep.
But God, a lot has happened in 120 years in Miami.
It's crazy because, hearing, and you first of all, the 1980s in general, that era was, I hear all the time, was a pretty interesting, cool era. But hearing stories from my dad and hearing stories from my grandparents living in Miami in the 80s, was really interesting. And, hearing how Miami, was created, how it's come into fruition to be what it is today. And, some of these influences from the past and some of these, things that have happened in the past have how it's impacted the way Miami has grown and how Miami has come to be out today. I think it's pretty interesting. And one of the things that I truly love about Miami is its history. So, I'm definitely got to get my hands on that book.
Yeah, it's definitely one to read. How did you come about, focusing on your main character? I mean, his name is slipping. I feel terrible.
Arthur McDuffie.
Arthur McDuffie. Yeah. Like, how did you come about finding his story and, using that as like a pivotal role in what happened with, the race riots that followed suit and the Cuban immigration into America? Was there, because his story couldn't have been alone, right? Like this was happening quite frequently in the Miami, greater Miami area. So what specifically about his story made you really hold on to that and grow from there?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing you've got to say is that it was very obvious during 1980 that the big shifts that are happening are shifts among the races that comprise Miami. And it's basically divided into three parts, Miami. White Miami is probably about 40%, then Cuban, Latin Miami is another 40%, and Black Miami is 20%. So I was trying to find stories where I could really dig into what's happening in those particular communities, because one thing then, and it's still true in many ways now, is you get to this sort of self-segregation, and these communities are very different. They don't know a lot about one another, and yet they are all represented by their own cultures and by their own radio stations, by their own newspapers. So you can literally pick up a paper in 1980 of this on the same day and feel like you're reading about three different cities. But Crazy. You're not. You're talking about one city. And so Arthur McDuffie for me was the obvious story for 1980, because he, just for people who don't know, he was a 33-year-old ex-Marine. He worked at an insurance company, was finally having a really good year, just won the company trip to Hawaii, trying to get back together with his ex-wife, and he's driving home on a motorbike one night and he gets stopped by police at 2 a.m. He decides to try and run from after he rolls a stop sign. It's an 8-minute chase, and when that chase ends, he's followed by over a dozen cop cars, and 2 minutes later, those cop cars call for an ambulance, and McDuffie's in a coma. He's been beaten. His skull is fractured so hard that they actually thought it was a traffic accident to begin with. The coroner said that it was the equivalent of being thrown off a 4-story building headfirst onto concrete. So he dies 4 years later. And as you said, Josh, this was not the first incident like that, even that year. It was actually the 4th or 5th incident. There had been a young Black girl, 12 years old, who had been molested by a white cop. There had been a Black guy who had stopped his car to pee against a building in the middle of the night, who was then shot through the back of the head by a policeman. There had been a wrong house raid where a Black school teacher had his skull fractured by the police. And Janet Reno, who was the state attorney then, hadn't indicted any police officers. So when the McDuffie incident happens, it's this moment in the Black community. They were like, oh my God, this one is so obvious. There are no other suspects apart from the cops. We know they've tried to cover this crime up because they rolled his bike around as if it had been involved in a bike crash, and it hadn't. And we knew all of this at this point during the investigation. So surely this time we're going to have some convictions of police with the loss of a black life. And of course, when you follow that story through 1980, that isn't what happens. And you get this crazy trial and then an even crazier 2 days of rioting.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned in the book, the fact that they scratched up both sides of like the gas pan and or the gas tank and the oil pan, right? Which is not very doesn't really coincide with someone who gets into a car accident on a motorbike, right? Usually only, like you mentioned, one side is scraped. So
yeah,
I mean, do you have sort of any inclination on, I mean, obviously it's pretty obvious why they wanted to cover it up, right? They beat the shit out of this guy and he ended up dying. But
yeah.
was there anything that you could find in your research as to like, why they thought that the tactics that they used was going to be good for the cover up?
No, I mean, it was pretty hasty. And, the truth is, if he hadn't died, there's no doubt they would have got away with it. And, one of the prosecuting attorneys said in the trial that had McDuffie recovered from that beating and walked in to their office a week later and been like, I had the crap beaten out of me by 15 police officers, that have just laughed him out of there. So really at that point, because he spends those 4 days in a coma, there's not that much panic to begin with. If he survives, it's not going to be a big deal. They think they can get away with it. But they also, one of the really disturbing things they then found out later was that the police who policed that particular district, Central District, which comprised of a lot of Liberty City, used to have a scorecard for how much they would, for how severely they'd beaten suspects. And it was a 0 to 30. And they classified the McDuffie beating as a 29.
Wow.
And that was sort of the equivalent of locker room talk. And the other disturbing thing they figure out is that the police who are policing that neighborhood on the midnight shift, they're all the worst officers on the police force. They're the police officers who the brass don't want to see in the station during daytime. So anyone with a disciplinary issue is sent onto that squad. And so basically you get this squad of guys, each one has been in more trouble than the last one. And off they go to police, one of the most crime-ridden areas, which has a lot of these you're going to get these moments of conflict anyway, but now you've got this gang of police officers who seem to have a long list of use of force and accusations of police brutality. So in a way, it wasn't, it was more of a when than an if that an incident like this would happen.
So I'm curious to know, as far as your character, your main character, knowing that I'm sure with your research, there's different cases that you've seen, different, people that experience different, situations and problems like this. What stuck out to you the most to really want to use him as that main character? What was it that brought you to that?
Well, first of all, I would say he's one of several main characters. There are probably four to five main characters in this book. There's McDuffie, there's the captain of county homicide who has to deal with this case while dealing with Colombian hitmen, while dealing with the Cuban prison population who are embedded inside the Mariel boat lift, and while dealing with the greatest ever rise in crime in homicides in American history. So he's got a lot on his plate. Then there's the female crime reporter, Edna Buchanan, who ended up winning a Pulitzer Prize for her coverage of homicide in Miami. Then there's the mayor who's desperately trying to keep a hold of his city and not let it implode, as it just seems to be imploding in different ways every week. And then I concentrate on a Colombian money launderer who was the biggest money launderer of his day back then, when we'd never seen the kind of money that was floating through Miami had never arrived in America before. It was just staggering.
It's definitely huge.
Yeah.
I think it's important that we maybe, set the setting, because a lot of people, they hear, the town, the city, Liberty City, and most people really nowadays, at least the people that I know, kind of only associate that with like some of the most elite athletes in America that we have today, right? A ton of big NFL players have come out of Liberty City. But back, when it was first being developed, Liberty City was a huge deal. Now it's kind of, I feel like it's kind of unfortunately become an afterthought in the Miami, political discussion. But back then being, the first major public housing project in the South, it was a huge shift for the city of Miami. Can you kind of dive into the interplay between the cops and the locals of Liberty City, and even within the local dynamics of, you know, the white population versus the black population, because you do touch upon that in the book?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of things that happened that really changed the way the demographics of Miami. One of the big ones is, of course, the arrival of I-95.
I love the way you describe that, by the way, in the book. It's amazing. A giant caterpillar with massive concrete legs.
Not to butt in, but I've heard that it had to do with dividing, right?
I feel like a lot of the major interstates did that. You know, I know I'm from Syracuse, and the same thing happened in Syracuse with I-81.
Yeah, it's basically wherever the population with the least political power is the most likely to receive, you know, a 8-lane freeway right through its center. And of course, in Miami, in when they were deciding all these things in the 50s, it was the black population, and they basically draw it straight through the heart of Overtown. And Overtown was you know, one of the oldest black neighborhoods in the South for sure. And it was where all the hotels, the movie theaters, and, you know, it was a real neighborhood. So what happens then is you get this sort of local emigration from Overtown, because, you know, your old house has now got a concrete pillar through it, and so the logical place for everyone to go was up to Liberty City, which had been this FDR designated public housing, and in theory a great improvement, because it had things Overtown didn't have in like the 20s and 30s, like running water and electricity. But of course, what then happens is you get white flight. It becomes a black neighborhood, and then of course you get all the redlining and everything else that we've been hearing so much about in the last few weeks. And you know, it is a neighborhood where I think only 20% of Miamians had air conditioning in 1980, as opposed to over 80% in every other neighborhood. And, you know, and you can look at the amount of banks there, very few, the amount of black-owned businesses, very few. And, you know, which banks are lending to black-owned businesses, very few. The only thing, there are a lot of churches. So, you know, lots of places to go and pray for, your future, but very few places who are willing to invest in your future. So very much a divided Miami.
So moving things forward now into the 80s, what would you say is the big shift that happened from that time period to the 80s, and then I would say to now that you're seeing?
Well, yeah, I mean, the big thing that happens in 1980 itself, which is crazy, is the demographics of Miami completely change, right? So if you're looking at 79, you're seeing this city that we described earlier, the balance between the three races. Then you get the surge of Cuban immigration through Mariel. So that's 125,000 people. City of Miami, which has its own specific limits, is around 320,000 people in 1980. So you basically got another small city being dropped on top of a medium-sized city. And
people forget too, sorry for cutting off, but people forget too all the time that, you know, even Hialeah was a predominantly white population. And you know, when the Hispanic community came in, especially Cuban, you know, I'm Cuban descent, you know, really shifted that, and now it's predominantly a Hispanic, you know, community. So, you know, I know that happens.
Yeah, but what you get in 1980 is when Mariel arrives, 125,000, you've got no housing, you've got no schools, you know, no spaces in schools, and it's a real crisis year. And of course, you get something that's quite familiar when you look at 2020, as you're asking, is you then get this sort of white panic, like middle class panic, like, hang on, the city's become Latin overnight. My kids can't get a job down at the department store because they don't speak Spanish. What the hell kind of American city is this anyway? And you get this extraordinary grassroots campaign run during the summer of 1980, where they want to revoke Miami's status as a bilingual city and make it English only. Now that worked out really well, right? We all know that was a total failure. But
more Cubans just kept coming.
Yeah, exactly. But in 1980, they passed that, and they revoke the county's bilingual ordinance. So every sign that's supposed to be in both languages gets pulled. So of course, what happens is, if you're Cuban in 1980, you're like, what the hell? we've been this entrepreneurial force for 20 years in this city. We've single-handedly saved downtown Miami, for example. Yeah. And now you're telling us that you don't even want to speak Spanish in this town. And you get this crazy thing that happens at the beginning of 1980, only 17% of Cubans are registered to vote in America, Cuban Americans. And then after that sort of slap in the face from the white community, you get this huge and, catalyst for people to register to vote. And then by the time the next local elections come in 1981, you've got 6 Cuban Americans who want to become mayor of Miami. So you get this reaction and this level of involvement that I really think changes the way Cuban Americans saw Miami. And it's like, oh my God, we've actually got to fight for our new home.
Coming from, I'm from up in New York, right? So until I moved down here, I wasn't very familiar with Cuban immigration or just, immigration from Latin and Caribbean America down up into the United States. After, reading your book or listening to it on Audible, it's really opened my eyes to just how crazy that whole time period was where, you have these hundreds of thousands of people coming by raft, and then eventually by, actual Navy boats, either coming from Cuba or coming from the United States to pick people up. And just the battle between the governmental powers, between Fidel and between the U.S. government. I think at the time it was Carter, right?
Yeah.
Where, even though the people wanted to leave Cuba and Fidel Castro had told them, okay, he starts packing these boats full of people instead of making sure that they're able to get the right requirements of people on. And then you have, boats capsizing and stuff. I know you touched upon, one major incident that happened in the waters between Cuba and Miami. How, in your research and in writing this book, like, what opened your eyes to the dynamic between the United States and Cuba that maybe you didn't see? Because I know that you're from England,
Yeah.
so maybe you're we're as unfamiliar as I am now about the subject.
Yeah. Well, what's fascinating is you realize what a sort of personal game this is between Castro and consecutive American administrations. And certainly in 1980 it was Castro versus Carter, and then whatever you think of Fidel Castro, he was one smart, he knew how to screw with the American.
He
knew how to screw with the American government.
If only he used it for good.
Yeah. But so what he does, and it's fascinating in 1980, is when you have this incident where 6 Cubans seeking exile break into the Peruvian embassy in Havana, and Castro has a fit and throws open the gates and is like, you know what, anyone wants out, just enter. Mm-hmm. And what he doesn't realize is a day later, there are going to be 10,000 people pressed shoulder to shoulder, and those pictures are going to be on the front page of every newspaper in the world, and it looks like Cuba's falling apart. Now, how on earth do you take that situation, and 10 days later, this is a huge problem for Jimmy Carter? That's kind of a work of brilliance. So what he does is he doesn't negotiate with Washington, D.C. or Jimmy Carter. He calls up the Cuban American community in Miami, and it's like, by the way, all those family members you haven't seen for 20 years, this might be a good time to come and get them, because I'm sure some of them are in the Peruvian embassy. So not only does he let the 10,000 go, he then lets anyone else go who wants to, but that gives him this shield where he can then hide the entire Cuban prison system, 4,000 people inside this other group of 125,000 people. So you get this, and it's not aimed at America, it's aimed at Miami, and it's aimed to sort of destroy the reputation of the Cuban Americans who've come here and done so well for 20 years. Now, of course, the people you really feel bad for are the 121,000 who were just ordinary, political asylum seekers that year, who then get tarnished, because they're traveling in boats with prisoners covered in tattoos who've done awful things in Cuba. And of course, those guys then hit the streets of Miami, and we basically have the amount of felons in our city more than double overnight. So, try and police that city in 1980.
It's crazy because, my girlfriend, her mom came, in the Mariel, in the 1980s, and she would tell me, because my grandpa would tell me too that they would send out all these prisoners too, and these felons from Cuba, and she would tell me that she would see people stabbing each other on the boat as she was coming over here, robbing each other, and it was frightening, and just to dive in a little bit more on that part, how would you say the actual group of, felons and prisoners coming into Miami, obviously not knowing who is who, not knowing who's bad, who's good. How would you say that had an impact in the Miami community in the 80s? How would you say that shifted certain things? Maybe the way that communities, maybe, good communities were, how did that impact good communities? How did that impact the city? And did it have a tremendous impact, or, did it eventually die off?
Yeah, I mean, there was a really cruel phrase that was used in the homicide department where they called, the criminals from Mariel, they would refer to them as a self-cleaning oven, right? The idea that they would just take each other out. And you did get a lot of that. And the coroner in Dade County then was a very distinguished guy called Joe Davis, who had more patience than anyone else in the South, but he went crazy that year just seeing folks from Mariel end up in the mortuary, and they'd also end up in the court. So it was again and again, it was Mariel on Mariel crimes. So yes, in a way, give that a year and it sort of sorted itself out. You're either arrested or you were dead. But it did change some neighborhoods incredibly fast. So the neighborhood I live in right here, I live on Miami Beach, and Miami Beach back in 1980 was actually some of the cheapest place you could stick anyone. So when they could hire all these old hotels, they could hire for $10 a night. The county could keep the recent arrivals in them, and they were living with next to Holocaust survivors who were in their 80s. So of course, really another bad combination to have bad guys next to some of the most vulnerable people in America. So crime on Miami Beach went crazy. But what it also did, which is fascinating, is it then, it sort of gives Miami Beach the chance to rethink itself, and all these old hotels start being torn down, and then you get the developers finally coming in.
So, given the times that we're in today, there's obviously a ton of correlation between what happened with the race riots in 1980 and here in Miami and the current, climate in society and culture in America today. Give us your take. Like, what do you maybe think led up to? I mean, obviously the death of George Floyd was a big part of that, right? And all of the police brutality across America that happened.
Yeah.
I mean, do you see a lot of similarities? Do you see a lot of differences?
Yeah, I think the big differences are the level of conversation we're having now is much more complex. I don't think in 1980 the answers were pretty much the same as they were at the last round of race riots in the 1960s, which was after those riots are over and Black communities had basically burnt their neighborhoods down. It was really a chance, certainly in Tallahassee, where they're like, well, we're not going to pump any money into those communities because that would be seen as a reward for rioting. So guess what? That $280 million you're asking for, we're going to give you 8, which is basically what happens in the aftermath of 1980. And, the mayor at the time was like, guess what, folks, if we're not going to fix the underlying reasons here, if we're not going to deal with poverty and imprisonment and, bank loans and redlining and money given to school to Black kids as opposed to educating white kids, then we're just going to move in a circle here. And I think that's what you've seen yet again. You saw it again in 92 with Rodney King. It's just something that hasn't been solved. But this time, I think the level of sophistication I think that the real reason for that switch and why it's a much more sophisticated conversation now is because it's not white talking heads having the conversation, which it was in 1980. Newspapers, Miami Herald had 1 Black journalist on the city desk. That's crazy. Now, of course, you've got 10,000 Black voices, telling their stories. And I think there's this slow awakening, and certainly you've now seen this crazy shift in about people who believe that institutional racism is an issue went from, I think, in the mid-30s to about 60% in 3 months. That's one of those crazy tipping point swings where you're like, oh my God, this actually begins to make sense to a lot more people. So my hope is that this time, at least there'll be some sort of real leap and addressing of the underlying issues so that, 40 years from now, we're not having the same conversation.
Yeah, it seems like we're heading definitely in that direction. I hope we're able to kind of find some sort of solution where we can, really help improve our, minority communities, even in Miami, where, you go to places like Hialeah, you go to Doral, and while there is development going on, along with development comes gentrification, right? Just tends to be that way. So, in your own thoughts, I'm sure you've had a lot of dialogue with tons of people about this. How do we uplift the minority communities while also allowing them to, continue to live where they want to live as the improvement happens around them, because things do get more expensive as things get nicer.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't know if I'm not qualified to answer that. Well, that's, you've had several generations of American politicians and
Yeah.
fail
Yeah,
fail at that one.
clearly.
So I'm just a specialist in one year in this city's history. I mean, you can find reasons to hope, and there's some new investment in Liberty City right now, which is promising. But yeah, I mean, it would be great to see some sort of this understanding of the redlining and the amount. I think once you've got schools where school budgets are tied to property taxes, and that you're living in a neighborhood where you can't go and get a bank loan to develop your house to sell it at the higher level, and then you don't have any money passing from generation to generation nor into the schools, then how is that child in that school supposed to compete with a kid who's at a school who's getting 40% more money pumped into their education? I mean, things like that have to be addressed. And if you'd like to think that if you can start restructuring those issues at the bottom of the pyramid, that the rest would take care of itself. But obviously we're not there yet.
So comparing these different eras, seeing from the 50s, the 60s, 70s, 80s to where we are today, which one stuck out to you the most, that most of these issues were going on, or where you saw these issues at the highest of their peak?
Oh, yeah, for me, it's all there on, black and white 1980. And, there's a lot more openness in a bad way. So, you get cops who willingly admit on the stand that they're, calling people the N-word as they're beating them within an inch of their lives. Things are just out front and center. The idea that you could be a money launderer and be driving around Miami every day with $1 million in 20s in the back of your car. There was nothing subtle about 1980, and that's why it's so much, it's fascinating to spend time in that year again, because no one's hiding anything. There aren't even any anti-money laundering laws. So, you could just be a lawyer in 1980 and your client will walk through the door with $500,000 in $5 notes and just say, hey, this is for the next 2 years in case I run into trouble. Everything's out there. And all those issues are so blatant that people are only just beginning to realize their issues at all. So I don't think we've ever seen anything like that before. What we have seen is that those issues that Jimmy Carter, when he pointed down to Miami during the election year in 1980, was like, those are Miami issues. Miami is a disaster, but it's not really anything to do with the rest of America. I think we can now say that he was entirely wrong on that. Those weren't Miami issues. Those were American issues, often geopolitical issues like drugs and communism, that just happened to aim at Miami because of geographic inevitability, that we're close to Colombia and to Cuba. But we were left to swing in 1980 without much help from the feds at all. So again, because of that, those differences were really stark in 1980, and now they're more complex now, but they're easy to understand in 1980.
So real quick, just because hearing everything you're telling me and us and all the research you've done, based off these conversations, I know you kind of talked about some of the issues that you feel that need to get resolved in today's world and in our era. What are some of the things that still need to get solved, that continue to linger on from the 80s, besides some of the things you mentioned? And what are things that you see that have improved, things that have changed?
Yeah. Well, look, immigration gets addressed again and again every decade. Obviously, Cuban immigration was hit first by some Obama decisions and now by some Trump decisions. So, you know, that's a huge change for Miami. And one wonders, you know, if Trump continues to you know, move, you know, be generally considered anti-immigrant for the moment, then how does that affect a city like Miami, which has really built itself on this free flow, fast moving immigration? And we know we've benefited amazingly from that, because of course, every time there's some sort of political instability in Central or South America, we tend to get capital flight to Miami as well. And we tend to get an amazing brain drain that comes to Miami. So we, you know, those things aren't good for the hemisphere, but they're good for the city we live in. So, you know, how does that work out long term? I don't know. Obviously, drugs were the biggest issue of the 1980s. The crazy thing is, if you look at polls in 1989, 10 years after all this starts in Miami, drugs, which people knew were a problem in 1980 in Miami, are considered the #1 problem in America, more important than nuclear war. You know, because of everything that Reagan and Bush had been saying during the 80s. Now, have we come a long way with drugs? We've come a long way with cocaine in Miami. We've put, you know, we slammed the door shut to some degrees in the mid 80s, but guess what? It popped up elsewhere along the, you know, Mexico-California border, and it's been kind of like whack-a-mole ever since. The parts of where the drugs come into the country changes, and then the drugs actually change. So now we're in the middle of, you know, an opioid crisis where actually you've now got established businesses, legal businesses, who become the drug dealers. So that's a huge change. No one would have expected that one.
Fentanyl too. You have fentanyl.
Yeah.
Huge.
Yeah. But the idea that these are made by corporations.
Of the actual drugs themselves.
Yeah.
What would you say? I know you spoke about you know, immigration and you know, just from what I'm seeing, I know there's, in everything that you look at, there's pros and cons. What would you say is that balance, or what would you say is that, or what would you say in your opinion on, you know, being able to understand that immigration has its pros, where it can help with, you know, for example, Miami was built off immigration.
Yeah.
And you during that time in Miami, you know, at least I can say when my grandparents came in, you had a huge migration of high educated Cubans who were able to build, you know, Miami and help boost it up. Same with other countries, other, you know, Venezuelans and Colombians and who came here as well. But at the same time, how do you approach the issues of, you know, criminals, you know, drugs, human trafficking, all that stuff that can happen and come through, you know, immigration as well? And this is me coming from a family of immigrants. How would you say you would approach that matter? Because there are pros and cons. And what would you say is your opinion on best handling that situation, since both need to be addressed?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question, but I think, again, if you look back at 1980, you've got both the sort of Republican worst case scenario and the Democratic worst case scenario happen in the same group of immigrants, right? So you've got this sort of the what you'd call the Donald Trump bad hombre scenario. Definitely it does happen in 1980. Not only do you have the 4,000 people from you know, the Cuban prison system arriving, you've also got a bunch of Cuban spies. Some people measure those in the 300 to 400 of them come in during the Mariel boat lift. So, you know, that's a real problem. And I think that addresses very real Republican fears of, you know, what can happen during sort of an uncontrolled immigration process. Now, flip that forward 5 years. A lot of those guys out of the 4,000, yes, they've wreaked havoc on the community. And I think Miami would have done anything not to go through that year. So, you know, I'm not belittling that at all. But what you do get is that 121,000 out of 125,000 within 5 years have all found places to live, jobs, their kids are in school, and you've got a totally typical, in every way, it resembles every other, you know, high-end immigration experience to America. So there's nothing different with the Mariel community whatsoever, except for that 4,000 people. So, you know, in the end, does the community benefit from Mariel? Yes, it really does. They're paying their taxes like everyone else, and, you know, they're adding flavor to a city that's got a lot of flavor already. You know, what could be better? So, you know, but it's fascinating because in 1980 you can argue that either way. I'm pro-immigration for obvious reasons. I wasn't born in this country, but I'm an American citizen. I just speak with another funny accent. So I believe those doors, that door should be a decent size, and that people should still be able to enter America. And illegal immigration should be illegal, but let's figure out where we want to draw that line, and then let's all follow those rules. But right now, it's there's no meeting in the middle between Republicans and Democrats, and you get these extreme positions that I think most of us don't favor.
Yeah, I think the whole argument on like, oh well, there's a bunch of bad apples, it's kind of bullshit. Just because there's bad apples everywhere. If you talk about the initial settlement of the Americas with the Spanish and Anglo-Saxon Europeans into Italians coming in and the Irish coming in, there's always going to be a criminal aspect when you're talking about emigrating to one of the most successful, powerful countries in the world. So I try to as best I can try to remove that from any conversation that I have about immigration or anything. But how much do you think that the cocaine industry played a role in immigrating to America? And do you think that Miami would be the same city in terms of its economic prosperity and in the way that Miami looks aesthetically if it weren't for that whole influx of cocaine coming in?
Sure. The short answer is no. Miami would look very different without cocaine. The end of the 70s, when cocaine starts pouring into the city, are a tremendously difficult time economically across America. Unemployment is high, interest rates are almost 20%. It's a disaster, except in Miami. No one quite knew why, but we had all this money that was willing to be put into developing, Brickell and downtown. No one quite knew where a lot of it came from, but people kind of knew where it came from. And there was a lot of capital flight at the time. So, with a good bit of accountancy, you could have perfectly good money suddenly mixing with perfectly bad money. And it was very hard to tell the difference between the two. So how much cocaine money was floating around? It's crazy.
Probably
so
all the money.
Yeah,
every dollar. Yeah.
But think of this, right? In those days, the Federal Reserve System in this region wanted to have a surplus or a deficit of around $100 million, right? And then suddenly in 1979-80, Miami's running a surplus of $7 billion. So that number was just so eye-popping. And that's all cash running around the city. There'd never been cash like that anywhere in America before. So that money has to end up somewhere. But how many people are delivering that money, and how big is that Colombian immigration that's dealing with the cocaine sector? It's really small. It's just a few hundred people who are basically doing the whole thing. So it's like a monopoly in some ways by a country, but within that country, of course, you then had these extraordinary fights on the streets of Miami between rival Colombian factions, because what was up for stakes was essentially an industry much larger than the entire tourist industry that year. I mean, that's crazy, right? It was an industry that didn't exist 2 years before, and within 2 years, it's bigger than tourism in Florida, which is the center of tourism. So, you've just got a few hundred people who are battling out over billions of dollars. And think of this. The number one paid guy in corporate America that year was earning $1.6 million, right? Carlos Lede, who was flying in cocaine, who was the head of transportation for Medellin, he was making somewhere between $250 and $300 million a year in cash, and of course not paying his taxes. So things are just on a totally different scale, a scale that hadn't been imagined. And Miami, frankly, benefits from that. The mayor said, "Hey, we know there's cocaine in this city. There's not much we can do at the mayoral level. It's a federal issue, but I can't really do anything about it. And if Miami is going to grow, Miami's going to grow. I'm not, that's just the fact of Miami life in 80, 81, 82.
So speaking about, now that we're talking about cocaine and, the impact that it's had on Miami, obviously both positively and as well as some negative. Where did you say, or how would you say the police played a role in this? Because I've heard stories and I've heard, conversation, even ex cops and ex detectives that, are now in their 50s and, 60s, who've told me, how things operated before and how they saw things and people were involved, where sometimes, you know, I even heard stories where, you know, these cops would allow, or they would be told to allow, certain shipments of cocaine to come in because they knew that it was going to help the city and they knew it's going to come in. But then there were certain ones that they would stop just to say like, okay, well, we're catching some drugs, so we'll stop a few, we're going to allow a few in because it helps the city. Do you talk about that? Is that something that you did research on? Is that something you learned more about? How heavily involved were the police in the whole cocaine game, and how, and was it heavy enough, or do you say that they played a big part in working with some of these drug dealers and actually helping them, or would you say that they were actually trying to stop them?
Yeah, I mean, look, I know this 1 year very well, so I can tell you that one of the two first places that were rotted by cocaine money were the banking system. When they first peeked under the hood, there were 26 banks accepting cocaine money, and the second place was the police department. Why? Because of course the police bumps up against crime. It's a sort of natural border, right? But what happens is that it's the homicide department who are trying to investigate cocaine crimes. They basically get corrupted by one relatively small-time cocaine dealer. So this is a guy who just splashes around tens of thousands of dollars within the department, which wasn't hard to do when you're talking about, you know, earning a million a week. And he basically corrupts over a third of the department and has them, arresting other drug dealers who are rivals to him, suspected in several murders of other rivals. And so what happens is the FBI then investigates the homicide department at the beginning of 1980, and they either indict, fire, or move an enormous amount of the homicide detectives, including almost all the experienced ones. So what you then get is the poor captain of homicide, who's one of the characters in this book, who's in charge of this department that has 3 detectives with more than 1 year of experience during the greatest ever leap in homicide in American history. So, you know, to that effect, cocaine had this incredible effect on what did and didn't happen in 1980 before it even happens, because the institutions get eaten away by cocaine money. And I think that's the real danger, even more so than the obvious examples of cocaine bloodshed, like, you know, in Dadeland, where you've got guys having shootouts in the middle of the afternoon and, you know, double, triple, quadruple murders.
I live right behind Dayland.
There you go. But the cocaine money was even more of a problem than the cocaine bloodshed.
And then I can agree. Then the Miami Vice show came out. The TV show.
That's right. And of course, the irony there is that it just made us sexy.
Yep.
You know, that sort of helps kickstart Miami's comeback as sort of like a naughty place to come and play.
Yeah. So you really have a trifecta of social issues, you know, really all being the catalyst of the riots that happened in 1980, right? So you have, you know, the death of Arthur McDuffie, who, you know, by the sounds of what you were writing in your book, was someone, you know, really on the come up of getting his life together, and, you know, battling back from separating from his wife, and you know, like you said, he's like, you know, doing a great job as his job as an insurance broker. You have a massive immigration of Cubans coming into America, specifically coming into Miami, and you have the drug war going on here, right? And by drug war, I mean like between, like you said, between neighboring or combative groups of drug militants. How did that lead into the big riots that occurred, and how did those riots end up, you know, fading away so that Miami could then again prosper in the future?
Well, there's a lot of fingers pointed in the aftermath of the riots as to why they happened, and, you know, one of the themes is, the riots would never have happened if they hadn't coincided with this extraordinary burst of Cuban immigration, and that really helped pressurize the city. But in my mind, that was a bullshit argument, and the riots are really only about one thing, and that's whether or not it was possible for Black Miami to get any kind of justice in 1980. And the riots they're all about the treatment of McDuffie, the fact that the trial was moved north to Tampa, which was considered a move that would almost assure the acquittal of white police officers, because Tampa had always acquitted white police officers charged in racial crimes. So that was really that was the reason for the riots. And in the aftermath of the riots, there's really only one neighborhood that's destroyed, and that's Black Miami neighborhoods. So they're the ones that don't come back. So you can look at the zones of the riot that night in May 1980 and compare them to the areas with the highest unemployment and poverty in 2020, and they're pretty much the same. So, that's a sad story of Miami, is that despite this incredible burst of prosperity that we've had over the last 40 years, it's really taken the Latin population forward at high speed. It's brought a lot of white investment back to Miami that had fled during the 80s. But, the forgotten part of the city is Black Miami. And so, they're the ones who still have the furthest to go. And the irony, of course, is that even if you go back to the charter of Miami way back in the 1890s, a third of the people who signed that charter are Black Miamians. So, I guess the answer is where's their piece of the pie?
So I gotta ask you, now that you brought it back to way back there, Miami's been, I know Miami's had a pretty good amount of interesting, developmental phases, and then kind of like broken down again, build back up. Like, look at the 1920s, this, I forgot the guy's name, but came down to Miami Beach,
Flagler,
opened up, it brought the trains down all the way to down to Florida. They opened it, they expanded the train system because of import and export. Now Miami Beach started growing, a lot of prosperity. You're getting wealth out there. They're building, I think it was these golf courses as well. And you're getting some movement down here, and it's like selling the tropical this and the retirement area, and then you got this huge hurricane that comes by, wipes out a lot of it, and then that's a rebuilding phase. And then now you're going into another phase as well. You're getting into later, as going into the whole Cuban migration. Then you're getting the stuff in in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. And then I think now again you're seeing another phase of Miami happening again now, obviously now with the growth of the city, where it's headed to. Where would you say, since you mentioned in the 1800s, a lot of that, going back to the Black community, would you say even starting through that point in the 1920s where things started to change, that affected, and then how did that continue on through where we are today? And how have you seen the Black community from then? I don't know if you know too much history about the 1920s in that era, but seeing from what you had mentioned, how you're seeing the votes from the Black community, how would you see that that died through?
Well, I think you had segregation in the American South. Obviously, you have Jim Crow. It's no different here than it was anywhere else. Or if it is different, it's because we had a large amount of immigrants from the Caribbean here, who were part of the founding groups. There were a lot of Bahamians here at the birth of Miami. But I can't vouch for history in the 40s, 50s, or 60s. I know there's one local historian, Marvin Dunn, who's done an amazing job following the story of Black Miamians through the century. He's got plenty of books out on that. But he's your go-to guy on 20th century Black Miami. That's not me.
Awesome. I'll have to check him out
for sure.
Before we wrap things up, I want to, first thank you for being on. I know you're very busy pushing out the book, and for everyone who's listening, it's an amazing book. Make sure you guys check it out either on Audible or it's available on Amazon, correct? Anywhere else?
Yeah, Books and Books. Anywhere good books are sold.
Shout out Books and Books here in Miami Beach
for the win.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, seeing as how there's so much correlation between, what happened in 1980 and what's going on now, obviously there's been a ton of progress already in the short amount of time since George Floyd's death. But where do you see, society and culture going, moving forward into the remainder of 2020 and, throughout the, we're only beginning this decade, throughout the rest of the decade? how do you personally see things shifting in culture and society so that we can move forward and we can finally learn from some of the mistakes that we've made in the past and allow all races and all communities to be able to grow and prosper as best as possible? Obviously, there's going to be some give and take always, but
Yeah, I think, one of the lessons I took away from 1980 was I was talking to one prominent black lawyer back then who had always said that the way white Miami had treated black Miami was like, if you're just patient, your time is coming any minute. And that was always the sort of carrot and stick. And then, of course, with such a surge of Latin immigration, it's like the Latins suddenly became the meat in the sandwich, and they were ahead. So if you were black, you were kind of thinking, well, hang on a second, I've been in this city since its birth, and yet suddenly I'm at the back of the line, and yet guys who have been here 5 years are somehow ahead of me in line here. How's this working? And I think that's the biggest story that plays out across the page of America today, that you've got this enormous, fast-growing Latin community across America that still is relatively underrepresented at a national level. You've also got an incredibly fast-growing Asian American population. So, my race complicated. You ask anyone in America race, black and white. That's the original sin of and yes, that's totally true. American stew, even in the last 50, 60 years.
you're fading in and out again, man.
So less, yeah. So those original sins while dealing with a much more complicated America. I think that's the story that's going to come. You're going to see people being like, hang on, I'm underrepresented as well. And I think that's certainly true. We had that Oscars So White a couple of years ago, but let's look at the representation of Asian Americans and Latin Americans inside America culture as well.
I couldn't agree more. I think.
Am I gone?
Yeah, I think you're good. You're good now. I think that we definitely have a ton of work to do, man. And I think, bringing back to the forefront some of the mistakes that we've made in the past, given what you've mentioned in your book, we have a lot of work to do, but progress is progress. I know a lot of people want to move a lot faster, me and myself included. I think, this is one way in which we can go about doing so is, having these difficult conversations and bringing up the past and learning from them. So I want to thank you again for being on. And I know Mendez has one final question before we hang things up.
Definitely. So first of all, thank you again for, coming on here and sharing your knowledge and value. And definitely get my hands on that book. So I have two questions. I know since speaking about the main character, we were talking about Arthur, and what he experienced with the police. Speaking about in today's world, seeing the situations that have gone on, seeing certain matters that have happened with certain individuals, and seeing how people are reacting with the whole police situations in our world today, in our country. When is it that where to create that balance? Because you're seeing extremes of, obviously we're seeing things of police brutality, police who take advantage of their power, and then you're also seeing as well as the wanting to remove police in, take them out of effect and not have any police at all, which is, both of them, they're not good. You don't want either extreme. So where would you say is the leading way to create that balance, to have, an awareness that, hey, there is police brutality. There is some police who do abuse it. Not all of them do. And at the same time, how can you balance that out so that way people understand, hey, you do need police. You do need some law in order to create, normalcy and not have craziness happen. Where would you say you can find or start moving the needle towards that?
Well, when when I look back at what my research in the sort of 70s and 80s in Miami, one thing that surprised me, which I found fascinating, was that back then the police weren't simply used for policing. So, for instance, Miami police officers used to get these little badges that were storks because they had often helped deliver babies. So they had been trained to do so. So when that call went out, 911, oh, my wife's having a baby and they couldn't get an ambulance there, but there's a police officer a quarter of a mile away, he'd go and do it. So imagine the difference in your neighborhood when a siren goes off and you know that it's not necessarily someone coming to, arrest your cousin, but instead it may be your little brother's having an asthma attack and the police are there to save him. I think that's something that's been lost now. Of course, it made sense. It made sense to sort of professionalize that, but at the same time, it then, it removed something from the police. And I think, again, you now get the police doing jobs that maybe that we also know highly trained individuals are supposed to do. Like, you walk into an apartment and it's a domestic violence situation. Is that a policing job, or should it be somewhere between a policing and a social working job? So, is it worth checking out things like that you can have certain situations where police don't arrive alone, and there are other people who know how to de-escalate situations, or even know the people who are involved. And then I know a lot of the guys I interviewed from the Black community were very much in favor of just policemen getting out of their cars in Black neighborhoods. The idea that you just can patrol from a car just means that you're there almost like a occupying army. And if you could actually get out there and sit on a street corner or just be out there. I know Miami's a hot, uncomfortable, non-walking city, but maybe there should be exceptions. So I think there's wiggle room here for improvement. But I would also say that for all the bad policemen who appear in my book, they're chased down by good policemen. And I met a lot of great cops, ex-cops doing this book who are made of exactly the sort of stuff you would hope would be made of people who are supposed to be protecting the public. And people put their lives on the line to protect the public in 1980, and it still happens in 2020. So I'm all for versions of reform, and I'm not for abolition of the police.
Amazing, and appreciate you sharing that answer. My last and final answer, just because I love to ask all the guests I come on here, what is the one biggest piece of advice you can leave off to all our listeners today? And this can be anything you want to leave off with.
Well, I would say it's worth knowing the history of the city you live in, because we don't want to be running in the same circles again and again and again. This is a fascinating young city with extraordinary history, but you should know it, because otherwise you're going to end up running down exactly the same roads we all ran down 40 years ago, which makes no sense. And we're at a time here where freedom of the press is an issue already, and just the amount of press there is an issue. The Miami Herald has a fifth of the circulation it used to have. There are a lot less places to do the hard work that it needs to defend democracy. We need investigative journalists. There's no doubt that Miami's always had a shady side to it, but we still need to shine the light. And I think that is key. So please support your local press, whether it's podcasts or however you get your information. Try and keep some of your life local, because those are the guys and men and women who are going to be shining the lights in the places where we need those lights to be shone.
Thank you so much for being on. I can't say it enough. I absolutely love this book. It's really taught me a lot about our history. As you were saying, I think it's super important. And after diving in, I'm going to definitely pick your brain a lot more on where to find some more local Miami history. But for all of you listening, Nicholas Griffin, The Year of Dangerous Days, Riots, Refugees, and Cocaine in Miami in the 1980s, out now, Amazon, Audible, any bookstore that you can find in your local area. Thank you again, Nick, for being on. We really appreciate your time. We know you're very busy, so thank you.
Thanks for having me on, guys.
Thank you very much.